Hey,
Hi, hi, Sarah.
how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much. How are you?
I am good, thanks.
Good.
So I'll let people trickle in, and while people are trickling in, let me just give you a brief background on this book club and who's members and who might be joining
Okay.
today. So I started this book club about 2.5 years ago, when I was feeling as a clinical psychologist just really frustrated with the system and how difficult it is for so many people to seek therapy, how waiting lists are really long and access to therapy is really hard, and people don't really know, where to start looking, and some people don't have, privacy in their own homes to do teletherapy. And so I kind of made a blanket statement, to help anyone find mental health care. And so many people wrote into me, not only asking for help finding mental health care, but saying, I'm not ready for therapy yet, but what about books?
Yeah.
And I realized, that there's such a need for people to know not only what, books are out there, but what books are credible and helpful and can acknowledge a diverse population. And so people who are part of this book club, some of them will be joining live, some of them will watch the replay. People were so excited when I announced that you were the author. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I always love talking about boundaries, and now is the perfect time to reinvigorate this conversation because we're heading into not only an election season, but also the
Yeah.
holidays, which really test our boundaries.
Yes. Yes, people wrote in with questions about both of those. And I see someone
Yeah.
writing in here, saying that they love you, and I think that you have many, many fans, as I'm sure you know. I'm sure everyone here knows who you are, but I'll just give a brief introduction.
Yeah.
So we are so lucky for our October book club to have Melissa Urban, who is the co-founder of Whole30 and the author of 8 books about the Whole30 program. And as you described in the intro of the book, through your work with Whole30, you were frequently helping people, and I'm sure are still frequently helping people set boundaries around food and drink and diet talk. And before long, people saw the gift you have in helping people set boundaries, and you gained the nickname of the Boundary Lady, which is well deserved due to, the immense impact that you've had helping people set boundaries, not only now with food and drink, but with, so many different domains, um, of life. And so obviously we are here today because you are the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Book of Boundaries, which is of course our October Wellbeing Book Club. And, as you said, I am so happy that we landed on this date because it is so timely with the election less than a week away and with the holidays, very, very quickly approaching.
Yeah.
And someone else I see wrote in saying, she loved this book so much, and the book will change your life, which, I think everyone here today can attest to the impact of the book.
Thank you so much. I always love hearing that. I probably get messages every single week from somebody saying, I read your book. It gave me the confidence to set a boundary. I had the conversation I've been wanting to have, and it really made an impact. And I feel like I know how to proceed now. So I love to hear it.
And, it's funny, I actually, I'm so impressed with the breadth of topics that you cover. It's 130 different scripts, is that correct?
Yeah, more than
Uh,
130. Yeah.
and on Monday of this week, I actually taught a teenager in therapy the stoplight analogy when we were discussing how she could set boundaries with her parents, and she loved it. So as a therapist, I get a kick out of reading books like this and knowing, you know, how I can enhance my work as a clinical psychologist. I'm curious if you think that people in your life have set boundaries differently with you, since you've become the boundary lady, that it's helped other people set boundaries with you.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the thing. When you speak clearly and kindly, when you say what you mean and expect your conversation partners to do the same, you are giving people permission to take the same tact with you. And it improves all of your relationships. My husband is a great example. When he first started dating me, he would say something like, I'm going for a walk. Do you want to go? And I would say, no, I need some alone time. And he was just not used to people speaking so directly and advocating for their needs. But then when he started to say, hey, I would really like for you to go on this walk with me. I could use, a partner for my mental health, and I had capacity to do that. I would say, yes, I'd love to go. So he started asking for what he needed clearly and kindly. He began respecting my boundaries, understanding kind of the backstory about, why I was setting them and why I needed alone time and what it meant for our relationship. So yes, I find that sometimes it can be awkward or difficult to be the first one to change the conversation dynamic, but by doing so, you give other people permission to do the same. And imagine if everybody in your family or in your job spoke clearly and kindly. They said exactly what they meant. They didn't expect you to be a mind reader. Your relationships would go so much smoother as a result.
Yep. And I see someone else writing in, saying they're currently reading the book and it's so good and eye-opening about how terrible the person was about setting and accepting boundaries. And I think that that's true. It's really a point of reflection. And one thing, and we'll get into the questions that people wrote in with, that I found really interesting in the patterns of questions that people wrote in anticipation of this discussion is not only questions about how do I set a boundary? And I really tried to, in the newsletter announcement that I set out, tried to say, please don't just write in saying, how do I set a boundary about X, right? Like you provide so many scripts of that I didn't want that to be the conversation. But how many people wrote in saying, I understand my relationships with other people more, or I'm more mindful of other people's boundaries. And so I think you really strike a great balance between not only helping people set boundaries, but helping them see the clear and kind ways that other people might be setting the boundaries for them.
Yes, absolutely. And also not taking those boundaries personally. When you become more comfortable advocating for your needs, you recognize that it's not about the other person. You are talking about a limit that you have set for your own comfort, for your own mental health, for your finances, for your time and capacity. So then when someone else does the same, it's very easy to shift into, oh, this isn't about me.
Yeah.
I asked this person if they can help me do XYZ, and they said, no, I can't help you. They must not have the time. They must not have the capacity. And I would rather they say no than show up resentfully or show up and hold it against me or say yes and then cancel last minute. It really is a kindness. So, yeah, it also has that trickle down effect into the way you receive other people's boundaries.
Yeah, and I think it's underestimated to how much people appreciate sometimes having a boundary set for them, right? That people aren't mind readers and people don't like guessing, is this okay? Is this comfortable? That when a boundary is clearly set, people, even if it might be a little bit uncomfortable, people often really appreciate it because then they don't have to do the guesswork and worry about how is this, action or what I say going to come across.
Yes, I talk to my kid about this all the time. My son is 11. And the other day he asked me to do something. What did he ask me? Oh, he asked me if I wanted to listen to his violin practice. He's playing violin for school. And I said, yes, I would love to listen. And he said, you don't have to. And I said to him, kid, I have told you a million times, I don't do things I don't want to do. I don't do things just to be nice. If I say yes, it's because I truly want to do it and you can count on that. And if I can't do it for some reason, I will let you know that I can't. And it's not about you, it's about me. I've been reinforcing that with him since he was so little. But when you say no, when you advocate for your needs and you are clear about that, it makes your yes more meaningful. When I say yes to something now, people know that I mean it. Because if I didn't want to, if I couldn't, if I didn't think I could show up to my full capacity, I would have told you no.
Yeah.
But because I said yes, you asked me earlier this week, like, is this still a good week? I said, yes, you know that I mean it. You don't have to question it. You don't have to worry. And that's really, I think, impactful in our relationships.
Yeah, I 100% completely agree. One thing that feels very full circle is that in the book, you talk about the boundaries that you set around the 2016 election. And we are 6 days away from election day. And I know that for everyone, this answer is different and it's not a one size fits all. But what last minute boundaries can people set to find a balance between staying informed and preserving their mental health?
So not scrolling, doom scrolling before bed is the boundary I set in 2016, and I've maintained that ever since. Nothing makes me more anxious, makes me want to pick a fight with my husband, leads to worse sleep than scrolling at night because I guarantee I'm going to come across something that's going to upset me. Here's my hot take, if you know who you are voting for or you have already voted, you can tap out of the news. You can tap out of election coverage. You can tap out of this like back and forth last minute who said what, if that is so stressful for you. I encourage everyone, do your research on your local ballots. They're so incredibly important, not just the national level. Make some notes about who you want to vote for if you haven't voted yet. But you don't have to watch every single thing that every single person says. And I will also say this, regardless of who you are voting for, I'm not watching the poll data whatsoever. I'm not watching it. I'm not listening to it. There is such a large kind of like degree of inaccuracy to it. And to just listen to the back and forth about who's in front is stressing me out. So I think anything that you can do that again makes you feel as though you're not just tapping out entirely, because those who are historically marginalized cannot afford for you to tap out entirely, but also are participating in a way that is not impacting your mental health and quality of life. That's the balance I would say to strike.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one thing that I'm frequently talking to my therapy clients about is you can only control what you can control.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that something like an election that can have, a profound impact on the present and the future, a lot of it feels out of our control right now. And so one thing that I'm often advising people, and I don't frame it as boundaries, although I think it really is what is within your control, whether it's about an election or about approaching someone about something that upset you or about taking charge of your mental health or whatever it might be. Make a list of what are those things that are in your control. And the things that are out of it are not, I don't want to say not worth worrying about, but are not worth spending a lot of time thinking about, because thinking about it is really only going to make it worse.
Yeah, that ties in perfectly with boundaries because boundaries are not about telling the other person what to do.
Right.
You can't tell the other person about what to do. A boundary is only about what you are able to do in your own life, the limits that you are willing and able to set. I think about it from the same perspective. I have my business and I have other people's business. And when I am in other people's business, I have no power whatsoever. And if I'm spending all of this time in other people's business, nobody is minding my own. So anytime I feel stressed, anytime I feel like that's like everything is out of control and I can't do anything, I ask myself, whose business am I in right now? And
Yeah.
99 times out of 100, I'm not in my own.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like that framework.
Yeah. And I love that phrase of whose business am I in?
Mm-hmm.
So many people wrote it, and I've seen some people say it in the chat here about being a people pleaser. And the way that you present boundaries in the book feels very straightforward, but I think you and I know that it's complex and it's often much easier said than done. Why do you think people so often prioritize other people's feelings and needs over their own and therefore struggle with setting boundaries?
I can tell you that historically, especially women and especially moms, we have been conditioned to do that. That is the patriarchy, that is stereotypically rigid gender roles, it's religious influence, sometimes it's diet culture, sometimes it's trauma, it's often the media, but we have been told our entire lives that everyone else's needs and feelings matter more than ours. And especially when you become a mom, we're praised the most when we are selfless. We have no self. We give everything we have to our family and our kids. And when we do advocate for our own needs, we are told we are cold or controlling or demanding, or we're called worse than that. So we have all of this conditioning that we have to unlearn, the idea that having needs is selfish, the idea that advocating for those needs is somehow selfish or cold or controlling or demanding. None of that is true. We feel this sense of very unearned guilt when we say, hey, I have feelings about this too. I have comfort in this situation too. We should both feel good in this relationship. I want both of us to feel good in this interaction. It's not selfish. It's not controlling. Your needs and feelings matter too, but we have to unlearn all of the conditioning that we've done. And probably that conditioning has been passed down by our parents and our grandparents as well. So it's a lot of unlearning, and I understand why it feels very challenging to step outside of the role that we have been told we have to play for so many generations.
And I think that that's all like so true. And I'm curious, and I don't want to um, play into gender
Mhm.
stereotypes, but so many people have written into you asking for help with boundaries, and I'm curious if there are noticeable gender differences in what types of boundaries people are writing in to you with.
My audience is largely women, so I do get boundary
Yeah,
requests from women the most. I do think that women have been far more conditioned to be people pleasers than
yeah,
men in our society. But I also think men struggle with this too. The people pleasing comes from a desire or a need to be liked. And sometimes that can come from a need for safety. If you say the right thing, if the other person likes you for it, you are now safe. And again, as women out in the world, we often do things that we don't want to do because we fear for our safety. But the same is true of any gender. We all want to be liked. We all want to be seen. We all want to be praised for being helpful. Men very often ask for boundaries around work because they want to be seen as one of the team and they want to get that promotion, but they're being taken advantage of. So, some of them I think are kind of span all genders. And then I think that there are those issues that are very particular to women because of our society and the patriarchy.
right. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
It's hard to say one of my favorite parts. A part that I liked particularly was you talk about the need to think about your future self, particularly when setting boundaries
Mhm.
with yourself. A couple people wrote in about this, and I try to, for the purpose of having to condense, many, many questions and not having too much overlap, try to combine them. And so two big questions that came up were how much do you think about future you when setting a boundary with other people? Like, does it just pertain to setting a boundary with yourself? And is there ever a time to listen to present you rather than future you when setting boundaries?
Those are really good questions. Do I think about future me when setting boundaries with others? Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do. Sometimes there are things in the moment where I think to myself, like, I really don't have capacity for this. I am so incredibly introverted and I get my energy from spending time alone. But I also know that sometimes I have to sort of flex my preference, or I have to extend the amount of time or capacity that I can extrovert because the needs of the family demand that. And I want to be there for the family in that capacity. So sometimes, yes, I think about, okay, I know you feel like you don't have capacity now, but I'm going to say yes to this. I'm going to show up and like give as much as I can to it. And I know that when I go to bed at night, I'm going to be happy that I did that.
Yeah.
So yeah, sometimes I do think about future me when I'm setting boundaries with others. What the second part of the question is, do I often just consider like present me? And the answer is yes. Sometimes I do too. When I'm thinking about setting boundaries with others, there is this concept, this kind of psychological fallacy called future discounting, where you feel like later you are going to have so much more time, so much more capacity. If you say to me, hey, do you want to do an Instagram live tomorrow? I'll say to you, oh my gosh, my schedule is slammed and I can't fit it in. But if you say, do you want to do an Instagram live a month from now? Yeah, absolutely. Because I assume that my schedule will be far less packed and I'll have far more energy and capacity. And that's just not the truth. Chances are, unless I'm going through a richly scheduled kind of finite period right now, chances are I'm not going to have more time. I'm not going to have more energy. I'm not going to have more money, and I'm not going to have more capacity. So sometimes when I'm setting a boundary with someone else, I think to myself, would present me say yes to this request? And if present me would say hell no, what is going to be different about future me? And most of the time, or much of the time, the answer is nothing. Nothing's going to be different with future me, and I should protect future me by saying no. So there's some nuance there.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's fantastic, and I think one area that I see it coming up a lot with therapy clients and with friends is talking about relationships and talking about um, perhaps topics in relationships that aren't affecting them right now, but they think, oh, well, by the time that it will actually come into play, it won't bother me as much. And so it's not necessarily about time, but I think that there's probably a similar fallacy in assuming that people will move past something or something won't hold as much weight to them in the future. And I think that that's, it might be the case in rare instances, but there's a lot of risk in assuming that future you is going to feel more okay with someone or something, or have more capacity, to your point,
Yeah.
than present you does.
That's a really good example as well. Things like fundamental values in relationships, right? Like I have been in relationships where I realized early on we do not share the same value system. And I really liked this guy. I really liked him. And I thought to myself, well, surely after we spend some time together, I'll be able to share my views and he'll kind of understand. And that was never going to happen, right? And I figured that out quickly. And as much as I liked him, I realized that there was an incompatibility there. But I think you're right. Whether you're talking about, do you want kids, or whether you're talking about relationships with, what are your relationships with your parents like? And what are your expectations? Do you want, what do you think about like both partners working or one partner staying home with kids? Like there's so many of these conversations that may not change over time.
Yeah. So many people wrote in about the stoplight
Mhm.
analogy, which makes sense because it's, pervasive throughout the book. And a couple people wanted to know if there's a situation that immediately warrants a red light or maybe a yellow light, that it's, too severe to start with a green light. Do you first need to identify what the green light boundary is and what the yellow light boundary is in order to gain clarity on what the red light should be?
No, sometimes no. And I think the biggest example of that is if your physical safety or your physical consent is being violated in some way, I would go immediately red. If someone, a stranger out in public, like touches me, I will immediately say, do not touch me and move away, right? I'm not going to green boundary that. That person has really clearly overstepped. And if you fear for your safety, if you feel for if your sort of physical space is being invaded, I would absolutely not feel any hesitation in going red right away and removing yourself from that situation or doing whatever you can to move away. In many situations, though, especially with people that you see on a regular basis and you engage with on a regular basis, I probably would encourage you most of the time to give the other person the benefit of the doubt that this person just doesn't realize that you have a limit. And once you express it, they will be more likely to respect it. Or this relationship has never seen a boundary in its whole life. And it might be challenging to implement them, but I have faith that this person wants our relationship to be good and will work with this dynamic over time. If you happen to know, based on lots of experience, if every single time you go to a family dinner, Uncle Jim is popping off with something that's like racist or homophobic or whatever, and like you've had that experience year after year after year, you don't need a green boundary that. You can go yellow and you can go quickly to red if you need to. So it is contextual, but I do want you to have at least all of those options so that you can evaluate each situation and start where you need to.
Yeah. And I think too, it makes me think a little bit about, I don't know if you've heard of dialectical behavior therapy, which is a type of therapy that I think is really, really useful. And one premise of it, or one skill, I should say, is called interpersonal effectiveness, which is basically talking about how in every situation you need to identify what is the objective of this conversation, what is my goal in the relationship, right? Is it to maintain the relationship, strengthen it, distance myself from it, and what is the self-respect piece? And it's really only until you've identified each of those three that you can gain clarity on how you want to approach a situation. And I think that perhaps most of the time, if you jump too quickly to the yellow light or the red light, uh, you're not observing the relationship piece, right? Because that's not giving the person the benefit of the doubt, and it runs the risk of discounting, the experiences you've had with the person in the past, especially if it's someone that you know to have good intentions.
Yeah. And what tends to happen, and I think the reason why the green and yellow boundaries are so important, is that when you hold in that resentment and that frustration and that anxiety, and you just continue to say, like, yeah, sure, okay, no problem, or you laugh through it, or you sit through it, and you hold it in, you end up having this like boundary explosion, right? You sit with it, you sit with it, you sit with it, and the 10th time it happens, you're like, this is awful. I hate it when you talk about this. I'm never coming to dinner again. And you leave. And the person, understandably, is like, what? So I do want you to have those levels and those steps because in many cases, you do want to preserve the relationship. You just want the relationship to be less hurtful, or you want the relationship to be less, feel like you're less taken advantage of. And if you immediately go to the red, it kind of doesn't serve that purpose. I want you to at least give it your best shot until or unless you realize that your goal for the relationship simply can't be met on both ends, in which case now you do have a red if you need it.
And to your point, I think so many people wait until they feel resentful or angry or they feel their mental health really declining to realize they need to set a boundary, right? Which is probably not the ideal time to be setting it, because then they're more likely to lash out or, behave contrary to character. What are early signs, before someone starts having negative emotions that might indicate to them this is something that maybe I feel okay with right now, but something that I need to set a boundary to, preserve my mental health, in the coming days or weeks or months?
I mean, I think that you will notice some sort of emotional or physical trigger. That's kind of your first key. So if you're holding resentment towards somebody, right? If you're walking around after an interaction and you're like, oh, this person like always does this and they're always taking advantage of me, or if you feel taken advantage in certain relationships, if you feel anxious around a certain person, or if you feel like you can't show up as your full self, you have to sort of modulate your personality, your behavior, the way you show up, just to make sure that that person's happy. If you're kind of tiptoeing or walking on eggshells with that person, if you avoid certain people, if the person, someone comes up on your phone or someone walks by your desk at work and you pretend like you're busy, those are all signs that there's some sort of overstep and a boundary may be needed or helpful.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting because I know people who have told me every time I get a text message from this person, I mark it as unread and I come back to it. And there has to come a point in which it's, is there a reason that that's happening? And I think often there are patterns, but people might discount that there's a pattern, right? And so I think recognizing those patterns early on, and also not discounting their emotions, right? Not saying, oh, I feel this way, but I'm overreacting, right? Because then you're putting, the blame on yourself, and there doesn't need to be blame, right? A boundary can preclude the need for there to be blame and have someone be in the wrong.
No, I mean, definitely there is no need to blame. But the other thing that I see in those situations is, every time this person calls, they put them on red. And then you're like, well, why are you doing that? And it's like, every time they call, they're constantly like dumping about their day and they just keep me on the phone for hours. And when I will say to that person, well, why don't you just tell them, hey, I only have 5 minutes. And then after 5 minutes, you say, okay, I have to go. And you hang up, they go, I can do that. I didn't know I could do that. I'll tell people all the time, oh, you don't like your sister bringing her dogs over every time she comes to dinner? Tell her the dogs aren't welcome. Tell her the dogs can come. Your mom wants to stay with you? Tell her she can't stay with you, but you'll help her find a hotel. And people go, I didn't know I could do that. And it's like, yeah, you definitely can. So sometimes people just need permission, or they need to understand that, again, they don't have to just accept what other people want or need from them.
Yeah. So many people wrote in with questions about fear of crossing other people's boundaries. And one that a couple people asked about is how to advise to a loved one that the loved one set a boundary with someone else or something else. And if there's a way to do that that's graceful or appropriate, or might it actually potentially be a boundary violation to assume or tell someone else that they need to set a boundary or should set a boundary?
Hmm. So, this kind of falls under like, am I in my business or am I in their
Yeah.
business? So when someone is giving me, a situation, I will often say to them, like, do you want to just vent and you want me to listen? Do you want me to affirm? Are you looking for advice? Like, how do you want me to be here for you? And so that's a very proactive way that I know how I can best show up for them. If they say at any point in the conversation, like, I just don't know what to do you have any thoughts? Then you have carte blanche to say, I think a boundary could be helpful. Have you tried telling them, please don't text me after hours? And, you can offer that advice if you want to, but if they haven't asked for that advice, it's not your business to give it to them. right? I've heard the phrase that like offering unwanted advice equates to criticism. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that in every single context, but if I'm talking to you just to vent and you automatically start with like, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? It makes me feel unheard. And maybe I'm not ready to move into a solution yet. Maybe I just need to like vent and talk about my feelings first. So I think it depends, but I do encourage you to stay in your business unless or until the other person asks for help.
Yeah. And so do you advise that people wait until the person asks for help rather than saying, do you want my opinion or do you want my thoughts? Because I imagine when you say, do you want my thoughts, that implies that you have thoughts, right? And then can feel like the person might feel pressured to say yes.
I I like to ask up front. Someone just dropped into the comment, are you looking for a
Yeah.
solution or support? So I like to ask up front. What are you looking for out of this conversation? And as often as you can do that, or when I call my sister, I will say to her, I'm going to call you. I'm about to just be completely ridiculous for 5 minutes. I need you to not tell me that I'm being ridiculous and just say, like, yeah, you're right for 5 minutes. Because after I get it off my chest, I'm going to feel a lot better
Yeah.
and I'll be able to view, right? So you can offer up front. But if you don't have that opportunity and the person launches into this, you automatically revert to like hearing, affirming, kind of sharing back what you've heard. And then if the person kind of naturally lets it go, cool. Then they've like gotten that off their chest and you've helped. If they continue to talk about it, you can say, I do have some experience with this situation. If and when you're looking for some advice or support, like hit me up. And that gives them the out. It's like they don't have to do this right now if they don't want to, but you let them know that you're open to helping at any point, like take it or leave it.
Yeah. Um, One, and I tried to steer away from choosing questions that felt, very specific or personal to people. But one question that I found interesting, because I had never thought that it could be a boundary violation, is you talked about grief in the book, and you talk about the different grief circles. Is that the right term
Hmm.
that you used?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and someone wrote in asking if it's a boundary violation to reach out to someone in the innermost grief circle to let them know that you're thinking of the person on an
Okay.
anniversary.
So the thing I want to share, and I love the consideration and the thoughtfulness with which this question is posed, but you can't guess somebody else's boundaries, and it's not your job to try to infer them. So what I would say is be as conscientious as you can given past experience. But if you overstep, it's only because you didn't know that person had a boundary. And once they share it with you, honor it from then on. So, as an example, I might not drop over unannounced if somebody has just died. I might not go over unannounced and expect to stay for a long time and start telling stories. I may reach out and say, I'd love to drop off a meal. I'm just going to leave it on your doorstep. I'm thinking of you. If you need A, B, or C, like call me. And if that person doesn't respond, then I would assume that that's a tacit boundary that they're not looking for ongoing connection in the moment, right? If you send someone a note on the anniversary, which I think is a kind and probably appreciated thing to do, and the other person says, thank you, this year is really hard, and that's the only thing they say, I might sort of step back then and not continue to engage. So, it's not your job to discern someone else's boundaries. Use social cues, use past experience. And then, of course, if they do state a boundary, obviously just respect that going forward.
Yeah, I think that that's really important too. And I think we potentially, if we're not using past experiences to guide in what we know about the person, we run the risk of making assumptions that the boundaries we would want are the boundaries other people would want. And
Yes.
then we, might misstep by either not reaching out or, if we don't have as firm boundaries, by overstepping. And so I think that, not making assumptions and not guessing and realizing that it's not our responsibility to
Yes.
solicit someone's boundaries and that we can trust that if they have boundaries, that they'll state it, and that's the time in which you honor and respect it, and that goes much farther than trying to guess ahead of time.
I totally agree. And you can also approach the situation, many situations, whether it's grief, someone's getting divorced, someone just had a baby, someone moved. You can preemptively say, hey, I would love to support you and the baby. I can come over and do your laundry. I can bring you a meal, or I can order DoorDash to be delivered to your house any night of the week. Would any of those benefit you? Right? So you can proactively offer some very tangible things that you are able and willing to do. Allow the other person to choose, or the other person might say, like, I don't need any of that, but like, oh my God, could you please come hold this baby so I can take a nap?
Yeah.
And you could say, yeah, I would love to do that, right? So you can also proactively offer specifics. I don't love this, like, can I do anything for you? Because in times of stress, grief, difficult seasons, it's like so hard to think about what you could possibly need. And it might be even harder to ask for what you need. But if someone comes in with highly specific things to offer, I am probably going to take you up on one of them, or I'm going to recognize that you're open to me giving you something highly specific that you could do for me. No, but I would love for you to go to UPS for me. And it's like, done, deal. So that's another way you can approach it.
Yeah. And I imagine too, like one thing I often talk to people about is trying to recognize their intention behind reaching out. And I know you talk about the difference between intention and impact, and I think I mean it a little differently here,
Yeah.
although I'm curious your thoughts as to if someone reaches out to someone grieving and says, you know, I know it's the anniversary, I'm thinking of you. And what they're hoping for in return is for the person to say, you know, yes, how are you doing? And to be there to console them. That's, it might seem kind, but it's not respecting the different circles of grief, right? And so I often say to people, what do you hope to get out of reaching out? You know, and if it's you're solely hoping for the person to know that you're thinking of them, that's very different from you're hoping that you're going to gain points with them and credit, you know, to see, oh, I'm a good friend, or that you're hoping that they're going to console you, and that it's really important to be introspective and realize that person might not respond. Just totally justified, right? Because they're grieving. And if they don't respond or they don't give you the response, are you still going to feel good about reaching out?
A gift with expectations is not a gift.
Yeah.
It's not a gift if it comes with strings. And very often, again, I will preface someone just got married, a friend of mine, and I knew they would be inundated. And I just sent a text message. I'm so happy for you. Thrilled to see you so happy. No need to respond, just sending you my love. And they didn't respond. And I did not expect a response. And like that is another really great way to do it. But yeah, you do have to think about your intentions behind doing this and what you hope to get out of it. And if you do have an intention, you either state it clearly, like, hey, I'd love to come over and do your laundry because I'm hoping I can hold the baby for 5 minutes. Say it out loud and see
Right.
how that flies. Or you just make the offer with no expectations whatsoever.
Right. Another theme that came up was people asked about changing boundaries and kind of the art of changing boundaries. And so there's one specific one and one more broad one. The more specific one, which I found somewhat interesting, and I'm curious your thoughts because I think I often am susceptible to doing this exact thing that this person wrote in about, was setting boundaries with work, but not always following the boundaries. So someone wrote in saying, I try to set a boundary, like not responding to emails after hours, but occasionally I do feel a need to send a time-sensitive email after hours. How can I make these exceptions while still expecting colleagues to respect my boundaries?
So that's just a clarity of your boundary. It is not that I don't respond to after hour emails. It is I don't respond to after hour emails unless they are truly time sensitive, right? That's like you're just clarifying the boundary there. So, and then what you do have to do though is you do have to hold not responding to non-urgent emails.
Yeah.
That's where things start to get slippery. That's
Yeah.
where they're like, oh, she's saying she's not responding, but it's like midnight and she answered me about this like thing that didn't really matter. So you can clarify your boundary. I don't respond to after hours texts or emails unless they're time sensitive and urgent. And I trust you to use your best judgment as to whether or not they're truly urgent. And if someone sends you something and expects that it's urgent and you don't think it's urgent, that just warrants like a follow-up conversation the next day, right? So sometimes just clarifying or sort of adding a layer to your boundary to make it more specific helps everybody understand the assignment better.
Yeah. And it's not exactly that, but one thing that I definitely took note of, from the book with work boundaries is in an out of office email, not saying we'll be you know, checking emails, intermittently or anything like that, just making it clear that you're out of office. And I think with that too, you speak so well about not needing to explain why you're setting a boundary, and I think that as a psychologist, and this is definitely a me problem, I often feel like if I'm taking time off, if I'm taking vacation, I have to try to justify it. And you know,
Sure.
I, I think it's a me problem, and I think, comes with the territory of loving what I do and, feeling the impact of working with so many people on a daily basis, feeling guilty for setting that boundary and sometimes prioritizing my own life and feel a need to justify or explain it. And I really appreciate that you talk about how you shouldn't add any clauses that might make the boundary less clear, and also don't need to explain why you're setting the boundary. You just need to set it.
Yeah. Often when we explain or attempt to justify our boundary, someone else sees it as a negotiation.
Right.
So when you tell a client, look, I'm going to be out and I'm not really going to have access to email. I mean, I'll have access, but I won't really be checking it. Now the client is like, well, if I send you a really important email, of course you're going to
Right.
respond, right? And now you're like in it. So I think it's a practice, but very often what I'll tell people to do is draft your out of office response
Yeah.
and then sit on it for a couple hours. And then I want you to go back and look at it and delete anything that isn't necessary. I have two different out of office, I have three. Out of my first out of office response is, I am out of office. I will not be checking or responding to email. Please email headquarters@whole30.com and they'll get you where you want to go. Meaning, even in an emergency, I am not contactable. Now, my admin knows that if certain things happen, she can get a hold of me, but like the world does not know. The other one is, I'm out of office, I'm traveling. If this is urgent, send an email to this person. They know how to get in touch with me. And then the third is, I'm traveling and I'll be slow to respond to email. Thanks for your patience with my response, which indicates that I'm checking in lightly, but like I might be on an airplane or I might be doing a book tour. But I'm very, very clear about what you can expect, and I absolutely hold to it. And it does require a little bit of commitment and maybe a little bit of discomfort from time to time, but practice makes it easier. And it's very freeing
Yeah.
just to be like, I'm out of office and I'm not checking email or responding.
And
See you in a week.
I think the really important thing about the third option is not saying, and I see someone writing in saying that their husband loves you for the gift giving boundary. The really important thing is saying I'm slow to respond to email, and not saying I'll respond by this date or within this many days or hours, because it's giving you the liberty to respond at a pace that's comfortable for you. And I think that that's really important, is we don't
Yes.
set deadlines
Yeah.
for ourselves arbitrarily.
The other thing I always say if I'm gone for like a week is I will reply to your email as I'm able upon my return. Or sometimes I make it funny. Like, I will be returning on Monday to an overflowing inbox. Thank you for your patience with my response. I never say I'll reply on Monday when I'm back in office, because now the person has an expectation that I'll reply on Monday. And on Monday, I'm triaging. And if it doesn't need a Monday response, I'm not going to give that. So you can be careful with wording. And I think I have examples of out of office messages in the book too.
One other thing related to maybe changing or modifying boundaries is someone wrote in asking if, if there's a long set boundary. And I'm trying to remember that someone gave a preface. I think it was about her dad spending time with her kids. If there's a long set boundary and either you feel the person has changed or your family is in a different life stage and you want the boundary to change, do you need to let the person know this boundary is changing if it's something that you've clearly established in the past? Or how do you go about renegotiating or reframing the boundary?
Yeah, I think you do need to let them know that it's changed, right? If you have historically, allowed your dad unsupervised visits with your kids, and your dad is now in a place where that would not be safe or you don't feel comfortable, I do think it's kind to let that person know, as opposed to just sort of like trying to enact the new boundary in a shifty way without them knowing. So I would just say, Dad, we're at a place now where I'm not comfortable with the kids being at your house, but you're welcome to come to my house while we're home to visit. And that's it. You just reset it. Sometimes the person will say, but you've always allowed this before. You've always let me bring the dogs over. In which case I would reply, I have, but I've never liked it. And it's not fair to you that I haven't said anything, because I've been quietly steaming about it. And like, that's not good for our relationship. So for the sake of our relationship, I'm telling you now, please don't bring the dogs over. It will make our dinner far more enjoyable. So you can acknowledge that you are changing the boundary. You can acknowledge that, like, you never said it before and maybe you could have or should have. But sometimes people just change. It used to be okay that people would tell me what my ex was up to. And now all of a sudden I'm like, look, I've moved on. I don't want to hear those stories anymore. It's absolutely okay to change your mind, but you do have to communicate that clearly.
And does it go the same way if there was like a pretty firm boundary before and you've now decided that there doesn't need to be as firm of a boundary? Do you still need to make that explicit?
Yeah, I think I will. Probably not with something like don't talk to me about my ex, because even if I'm over it now, I like kind of still don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
But if, before you didn't want the dog coming over because the dog was a puppy and not well trained, but now the dog is older and well behaved, you could always say, hey, you can bring the dog. Like, I know we haven't done the dog before, but I feel like the dog's in a different place. My kid is a little bit older. I think you could bring the dog over and it wouldn't be as chaotic. So, yeah, if you want to come for dinner, like, bring the dog over. If you want to kind of do a test run, I absolutely think you can do that. Yeah.
And I imagine too, in that case specifically, it's important to make it clear, that this is a trial and not open the door for there to be an unlimited invitation. Is that correct?
Sometimes, I mean, maybe sometimes it's a trial. Maybe sometimes it's just, I just don't feel that way anymore. Or, I mean, I'm trying to think of an example, the mother-in-law dropping by without calling.
Right.
Maybe you set a boundary that they need to call every single time. And now you're in a place where the kids are older and maybe you're retired, and it's sort of like, you know what, Jamie, come on over whenever you want. Like, we're just in such a different place now. And if you happen to be in the neighborhood, like, yeah, go ahead and drop by. It could be a permanent change too. It just kind of, again, depends on your context, but I would only give as much as you are willingly and comfortably able to give if you are sort of expanding a boundary.
One thing too, and you touched on this earlier in talking about your son, is the way you talk to kids about boundaries. I guess using your son as an example, but several people wrote in asking, I think there is some, well, I shouldn't say universal agreement, but a lot of people teach boundaries around physical boundaries with kids, right? And a lot of, I have a lot of child clients, and they're often talking about grandparents, and you talked about this in the book, grandparents coming over and immediately wanting to hug them and kiss them and making them really uncomfortable. And I think talking about boundaries with kids in that sense, a lot of parents do that. But what about other boundaries? I mean, how do you set boundaries with kids? Like, at what age did you start thinking about the stoplight analogy with your son, for example? And how is a graceful way to start talking clearly to kids about boundaries besides, some of the ones that might be common to talk to them about?
It's funny. This is such a specific topic because kids' brains aren't developed like adults. And as they grow older, of course, their brains are changing so rapidly. So when I did the paperback version of the book, I actually brought a child psychologist in to answer some of these questions about boundaries with kids. And I actually discovered that I was doing it wrong in some instances with my kid. I wasn't setting a boundary. I was sort of enforcing a punishment or a consequence. So I can speak to my son now who's 11 and older and clearly understands things like, please don't come into our room before 6:30 tomorrow. I need, I want to sleep in, or like, I'm working out in the garage right now. I need 20 minutes. When it's 7:15, you can come in and we can talk about Minecraft. He understands that now, but when it comes to much younger kids, I probably would say you'd have to like talk to a street cred like child therapist about that, because it's complicated, it's complex.
Yeah. You are, and it's a testament to the number of people who wrote to me when I announced the book, thanking me for featuring you in the book club, and the number of people who have written since reading the book, saying how much they appreciated it, and the number of people here writing and saying how life-changing the book has been. Your thoughts and the scripts are such a gift to everyone. For people who want to consume more of your wisdom, where can they, get more of your thoughts?
Yeah, Yeah, so I'm very active on Instagram. So this channel right here that I'm talking to you from, and I talk about things that, of course, are very boundary centric. I talk about fitness, I talk about relationships, I talk about therapy and mental health and kind of all sorts of things that are tangential, I think, to food and physical health. I also have a newsletter that is free at melissau.com, just like my handle here. And I also continue to talk about things that are kind of within this scope and realm. And I often answer readers' questions in this kind of Dear Melissa series if they have questions about boundaries or questions about relationships. So those are two places to connect with me on more stuff like this.
Um, and I'm sure, I'm sure a lot of people already do follow you on Instagram and subscribe to the newsletter. I guess two other
Mhm.
questions, sorry, that I forgot to ask that I wanted to
Yeah.
ask earlier, going a little out of order, is aside from the misconception that setting a boundary is not trying to control people, are there any other big misconceptions that you think there are about
Well,
boundaries?
I think we definitely touched on the idea that boundaries are somehow selfish or somehow controlling or somehow demanding. I think another common misconception is that boundaries are designed to kind of keep people at a distance. They're designed to keep people apart. And that could not be further from the truth. A boundary is designed to improve your relationship. It is saying there's an element of this relationship that doesn't feel good to me, and I want it to feel good for both of us. And if I express my needs clearly and kindly, you are then able to meet me in the middle in a space where our relationship feels better to both of us. So boundaries are a way of keeping people in your life, not excluding people from your life. And I think that's a common misconception.
Um, yes, and I think that's very true. And I don't remember the phrase off the top of my head, but there's a phrase that I love that you talk about with fences and
Yeah.
neighbors that I think speaks to this, very well. One final question, and it's broad, and if it's too broad to answer, I totally understand. Is with the next week, and we talked about this next week, and the holiday season coming up. Any broad advice or thoughts, for people getting through the rest of, I was going to say 2025, the rest of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the rest of, yes. I actually have a series I do on like pre-holiday boundaries. And so, kind of the first step, if you know that your family tends to dive into topics like politics or religion or just other topics that are divisive and that really take away from the event, you can kind of preempt by calling the host ahead of time and being like, hey, so excited for Thanksgiving. What can I bring? What are you making? Hey, I just want to throw this out there. When we start talking about politics at the table, nobody has fun. And so I would love to ask if we can just make politics a topic that's like off limits during Thanksgiving. What do you think about that? Now, you can't make other people not talk about it, but if you can at least get some buy in from the host or from other folks, then when Uncle Jim brings it up, a few of you can go, we decided not to, and kind of shut them down and change the subject. I also do want you to have a backup plan, though, right? I want you to have your yellow boundary, which is at the table. If someone does bring it up, you can say, this topic is not something I'd like to discuss. And I think we'd all have a much better time if we didn't. Can I change the subject? And then change the subject to something that you all want to talk about. If they insist that this is going to be a topic of conversation, I need you to figure out whether or not that's a dinner you want to be at. And I want you to not be afraid to say, I'm so uncomfortable and so unhappy at this table right now with the way the conversation is going. And I'm not asking you not to talk about it, but I'm going to excuse myself. And I want you to have an exit plan. Maybe it's just going for a walk for an hour. Maybe it's doing the dishes in the kitchen. Maybe it's leaving. But whatever it looks like, I do want you to think through what your green, yellow, and red might be to make sure that you also enjoy your holiday because you deserve that too.
Yep. I think that that's so important. Thank you again so much for writing the wonderful book, for helping so many people, for, I think just the amount of scripts you have in there, again, speaks to how much people respect your thoughts and how clear it is that you care about, the various, difficult situations that people encounter. And we so appreciate your being our October book club speaker. And yeah, just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I was so excited to hear that you picked the book for your book club. I've really enjoyed talking to people, and I hope to connect with y'all more here on Instagram. So thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you. Have a good
Okay,
night.
thanks. You too.
Bye bye.